All right. So my whole Eddie Murphy thing kind of blew up in my face because the link didn't work. So all you guys saw was the stuff from Delirious in the red leather suit, and I wanted you to watch that. That's why I posted the stuff from Raw with the purple leather suit. That was supposed to be with. You're supposed to watch all that together, and it sucks because this isn't going to have the same impact as it would had you seen both of those together, basically. So I would urge you to go back and look at the Raw clip, specifically one in Eddie Murphy Raw. There's a clip that I contend is one of the most important stand up bits ever. It's really, yeah, it just, for this course at least, wow, I got a double chin there. Actually, just one huge chin. Um, I, I'll get to that, but I want to get through this Eddie Murphy video so we can all move forward. Um, okay, so Eddie Murphy's another one of those guys who is like a totally different person from me to you, most likely. For me, he was just this comedy savant, right? When he basically saved Saturday Night Live at like 18 years old. Like saved it from being like canceled. It's still on the air now. He did these two comedy specials, Delirious and Raw. This is he. I mean, he just ruled the '80s basically. Um, he was 22 years old during Delirious. 22. Some of you might be close to that now. And 26 when he did Raw. So like Delirious 83, Raw is 87. But Raw was probably like his peak. Certainly stand up his peak. I don't know that he did stand up after that because his movie career was huge too. So he does Trading Places, he does Golden Child, he does Beverly Hills Cop, just all these iconic comedy movies. So like that's the Eddie Murphy. When you say Eddie Murphy, that's what I think. Like as big a star as you can imagine. Um, your Eddie Murphy is probably like Daddy Daycare. I probably wrote this in the description. Like Donkey from Shrek, right? Like that's your Eddie Murphy. So completely different conceptions of this guy. Um, so I mentioned like Delirious was 83 and he was 22. Raw is 87 and he was 26. So 4 years span in between. Not a ton of growth. Like a lot of you, rightfully so, watch those Delirious clips. Again, Delirious is red suit, leather suit. Raw's purple leather suit. And you're like, yeah, kind of not, you know, kind of not, no depth, right? Superficial, funny, but derogatory, right? A lot of negative stereotypes and things like that. And, you have to frame this by the time, like, we kind of had a little back and forth about it. Um, Tyler asked me you know, if Eddie Murphy was still doing this kind of comedy now, and I'm like, yeah, it would suck, like, but I don't think he would be, right? I would love to see him come back. There's people whisper about him coming back and doing stand up, and love to see what it's like. Um, but in the '80s, like this is going to be, like I said, it's going to be so hard to contextualize since you guys haven't seen those raw clips. Um, so this is my take on it. He was this superstar, and he was the '80s in general. Like take Eddie Murphy out of it, the '80s period. In take comedy out of it, take entertainment out of it, whatever. There was this the '80s was this gender boom, right? Women going back to work, right? Every sitcom from the '80s has a prominent mother, wife figure that is balancing work and home life, right? Which was very new at the time. So new that it was this hilarious joke. Like, right, the fact that all these sitcoms were like, hey, what, all these women are going back to work. How hilarious is that, right? Um, like, who's the boss? And I mean, all this kind of stuff. So the stand up from this era is went one of two ways. Okay, we built this sort of base, this foundation of like Carlin, Pryor, and Bruce, right? They're this base of just like, okay, this medium starting to, you know, starting to move not only um, it's starting to move outward from just being jokes, right? It's being about something and all that kind of stuff. And we can say whatever we want without getting arrested. Like it just started to loosen up. And by the '80s, you got like anything, like any new movement that has any type of success. I think it starts to we get further away from it. We start to forget like the impact and the power of what we were fighting for, if that makes any sense. Yeah. So that's what was happening in the '80s. It was like guys like Eddie Murphy. Now, Eddie Murphy did it the best, if being the best at this kind of shitty thing is what you want, but shock comedy was all the rage in the '80s, and Eddie Murphy 100% tapped into it. Now, I spared you guys from having to watch, which I usually do. I usually have my classes watch Andrew Dice Clay and Sam Kinison, because they sort of really leaned into the shock comedy thing. And shock comedy means you're really just saying shocking things for shocking things' sake, right? Being super gross, being super loud, being obnoxious, like being that kind of comedian was hugely popular in the '80s. In fact, Dice Clay just skyrocketed to fame. He sold out MSG in like 5 minutes or something as a stand up, which is not, in the '80s especially, was not typical. But it's just my point about the foundation I'm talking about, and how with any movement, typically the further you get away from it, the the more quickly we forget about what we were fighting for. So I always say this, like if Lenny Bruce saw Andrew Dice Clay or Sam Kinison or Eddie Murphy for that matter, I think he'd say, wait, I fought for this. I fought for the right for this to happen, for guys to just go up and be assholes for an hour and get paid for that. Like, that's not, you're doing it wrong. And Eddie Murphy is in that category for me. So the 80s is defined by two different sort of streams, right? There was the shock comics who had a ton of success really quickly and then kind of burned out. Like even Eddie Murphy, he did two specials in 4 years. Like that's a short career, right? Dice Clay did, when he blew up, it was like a 4 year thing before everyone was like, but like basically like me, like okay, I get, Jesus, I get that, I got your shtick now. Now what, right? You can't just come up here and give me this bullshit. I've seen it before. Kinnison actually died. I don't know if car accident, but I'm sure he was all over the place on drugs. Um, but yeah, they didn't change. They didn't evolve. Dice Clay's claim to fame is these filthy nursery rhymes. Like, I mean, they're brutal, but people lost their minds over them. It was a different time, guys. The 80s, trust me. So that was the one stream. The other stream was the Seinfeld, right? Almost the exact opposite of shock comedy was observational, quote unquote, right? Down, getting down into the minutia. Like, did you ever notice this? Like the universal, uh, and that kind of defined the decade. It was like those two. You're either one or the other, and you know, both were kind of, what are we doing here? you know. Um, so Eddie Murphy, I think, was the best of the shock comics because there's something there, and it maybe like a lot of you were saying like, not for me, just no depth. As like, I just want to explain to you like the times in which he was performing. So a lot of the stuff from that first one, stand up can have this effect. It can crystallize ideas and thoughts and just culture at different time periods throughout this society. And when you hear him talk about gay people the way he does, and he's getting, I mean, he's filled this arena with people, and they're howling, laughing at this stuff, right? These were the sentiments at the time. And Eddie Murphy at 22 years old, like, think about you right now. You're almost that age. You're kind of a piece of shit, right? Like, a little bit. He's out there performing. He's trying to get a laugh. I think he's saying a lot of things, just like, this is where we're at now. Women and homosexuals specifically, right? Because you got to take race out of it, because Eddie Murphy's not going to complain about. I shouldn't say that. Eddie Murphy's black, so I don't think he would complain about his own. Like that certainly wasn't. That would come later. That would come in the 90s and the 2000s with Chris Rock, with this like cultural introspection. Like, what's our role in this plight? What are we doing? It's not all just the whitey we have some issues too. Anyway, this is my big overall theory on Eddie Murphy and the like, and shock comedy in general. I was like, I mentioned before, this gender boom, right, of the 80s. Like, for guys like Eddie Murphy and Andrew Dice Clay and Sam Kinison, like, with women and homosexuals emerging in the culture, getting more rights, being treated more fairly, there was men traditionally traditional toxic traditional masculinity was starting to be threatened. Now, that's a ridiculous reaction, but I think it's true. Like, at every turn, all of those guys, they talk about, now I love women. And then they say all this shit about women that's, you know, derogatory. It's out of fear. A lot of Eddie Murphy's comedy comes from fear. And if you watched Raw, he does a 15-minute bit about women and don't get married and all this kind of about women. He's terrified that he's going to marry somebody and they're just going to take all his money. Like, that's his thing. So it's when you start watching these, and that line, like, now I love women, but is the same as, well, I'm not racist, but, right? Like, there's more to it than that. So what you see in Eddie Murphy in these two performances is a guy who is sort of mired in, or clinging to, I guess, clinging to these thoughts of traditional masculinity, where he talks about in Delirious, where, remember when you could just hit your woman, like, those were the days, right? Like, Barry has a very MAGA sort of twinge to it, right? Um, so I think he feels threatened. And the other two guys I was telling you about, Andrew Dice Clay and Sam Kinison, are probably worse. So that's what makes this stuff so interesting, to me at least, right? Um, so anyway, yeah, this is my sort of thesis, I guess, on Eddie Murphy and the like. Um, his misogyny and homophobia are an indication that each of these groups were becoming a threat to traditional masculinity, right? Because he talks about, Eddie Murphy's all about into this, like, he thinks he's so hot and he just likes to fuck or whatever, right? And everyone wants to fuck him. So that for him, that's a big part of at least his public persona. So the leather suits and look at my ass and, like, oh yeah, I got all these women, whatever, that's kind of his thing. So he's like trying to protect that, even though it's pretty shallow and shitty, right? Um, yeah, lamenting the days when women knew their place, right? Which is like, to us, we're listening to it and we're like, oh man, that's pretty tone deaf. Like, he whiffed on that one. But you can hear the response in the crowd in 1980. They're howling. They're like, yeah, so, like, it's kind of scary to hear, this. These are popular opinions, right? And then, when he talks about AIDS, right? Like it's kind of hard to condemn him for his pretty rudimentary and backward ideas about it, because that was how people understood it at the time. They thought you could get it from kissing through saliva, like you could get it from kissing somebody. They thought, it was just um, gay people getting it. They thought, oh, this horrible, horrible um, things, and completely ill-informed about it, right? So he's up here spewing all this stuff, and we're like, that's not right. But at the time, I mean, AIDS was real. Like it was palpable. The AIDS epidemic, um, and for him to go up there and like just run his mouth like that about it without really knowing anything about it, obviously everything he said turned out to not be true. Um, it just added to the fear, right? Afraid of homosexuals, giving his girlfriend AIDS, and her bringing it back to him. Like, what? Like, just just stop, dude. But the way he talks about all this stuff like it's perfectly normal, um, is kind of scary. And again, like it's in between. The '80s was right in between, like you got '60s and '70s, where um, you know the Carlin, Pryor, Bruce thing, and Cosby had been going on. Now we're sort of like, well, I want to do my own thing and be a rebel. Well, what would that be? Just, being ignorant, I guess, was hilarious at the time. Um, so he kind of represented that. That doesn't mean that there's nothing of substance in in his work. Um, like there's the bit from Delirious where he was going to Texas, and everyone says, "Oh, don't go to Texas." And again, this is 1983. You can't be black and go to Texas. Like that was a predominant theory. So, kind of just what racism does to the to the minority, right? When he's like, "So I went there looking for racism." Because it had been so hyped up. And I got off the plane, someone asked to help with my bag, and I'm like, it's my own motherfucking bag. You know, like he came in with this chip on his shoulder, like ready to be, you know, looking for it when it maybe wasn't there. Right? That's what it can do. Um, but if you watch Raw, and if you get some time, go back and watch those clips. I again apologize for fucking that up, but Raw is defensive. He opens with reaction to um, stuff from Delirious, talking about how now the gay community was after me because of all that shit I said. But um, the biggest, if you do go back and watch Raw, at least watch the Bill Cosby bit, because that's the bit I was talking about at the beginning of the video. It's one of the most important bits in stand-up history, and for this course at least, because it ties in everything before it, where it's like ties in Bruce and Pryor and Cosby and Murphy is kind of, he's at the peak now, you know. So he basically tells a story about Bill Cosby called him. And so he's doing the Cosby accent, right? He's doing the Cosby voice, which is perfect. And he's basically saying that the story is Cosby's son wanted to go see Eddie Murphy. So he says, okay, gives him money for the ticket. He goes to see Eddie Murphy. He comes home and he tells him about it. And Cosby says to his son, hey, what, you know, how was it? And his son just says, oh, he says this and that and kiss my big black stuff and shit and fuck and all these curse words, right? So after that exchange with his son, Cosby calls Murphy to basically lecture him about how to do stand up. You can't do that. You can't say filth, flour, and filth because, Cosby won't curse. Filth, flour, and filth. And Murphy's, doing this mock phone call. It's like, I didn't say filth, flour, and filth. And then Cosby eventually says, you can't say fuck. So he got Cosby to curse. Anyway, just this bit, it's so well done. Then he says, I was so pissed, I called Richard Pryor and told him what Cosby said to me. And now he starts doing a Pryor impression and Pryor's take on the whole thing, So just crystallizing this single bit, you see Cosby, number one, who we didn't even talk about this in the Cosby video. As he grew into the 80s and 90s or whatever, he started to be accused of being an Uncle Tom, a complete sellout to his community because he wasn't embracing these, black culture, as it were. Right? He was actually fighting against it, the way they talk, the way they dress, like all those kinds of things. So, there it begs this question, which that white people generally don't have to answer, but minorities a lot of times do in this country have to answer, like, how much of myself do I have to give up today just to survive and fit in and be a functioning person in society? Like, my true identity, how much do I have to hide? Or, how much do I have to play along with basically white run America? And it's just, I don't think white people are asked that, to give up parts of themselves, right?